but I think kids are very sensitive, like when, say up to age 12, of doing what they think is age appropriate. In other words, if something becomes considered like what a kid would call a baby property, like there's, well, they wouldn't call it a property, but a baby book. Oh, Spider-Man, that's for little kids. You're going to lose them.
Welcome to the Comics Cube, everyone. Today I am joined by Jim Salicrup, a legendary editor in the comics industry. How are you, Mr. Salicrup?
I'm good. Legendary is like a euphemism in the business for old.
Well, I think
I'm kidding.
The first thing I was going to say was, when you talk about legendary, you edited the Dark Phoenix saga.
Well, I edited a version of it. In my version, she lived, and it was published as I think the Untold Story, Dark Phoenix, but it was a case of a lot of different creators, all working on a project at the same time, and had an aspect of a little bit of a committee. And so I think some of the early discussions on what the story was ultimately going to be took place with my predecessor, who I was his assistant, Roger Stern, and Jim Shooter was the editor-in-chief. And to say that being the editor-in-chief is a difficult job, and I'm sure it's easy for Jim to forget who he spoke to and when you're trying to juggle so many titles around us. He was very hands-on. So I think what happened is some of the stuff that Roger knew when he was editing it, I didn't know. And so I had an interpretation of what it was all about, and others, each one I think had an idea of what it was all about. My thinking on it was, the Dark Phoenix was something that sort of was an evil entity unto itself that possessed Jean Grey, and if they got that out of her, then she was good old Jean Grey again. Whereas others thought, no, this is Jean Grey. She just committed a horrible, genocide, and needs to be punished. So fortunately, Jim Shooter was the editor-in-chief. He was able to step in at the right time, at the last minute, make some changes, and that became what is the Dark Phoenix classic story. It was Louise Jones was going to edit the X-Men anyway, so she got to start at a very interesting point. So you could see the way I edited it based on that Dark Phoenix, the Untold Story, and fortunately Jim Shooter was there, and he's I think the most responsible for making that such a legendary story.
Would you say it was the right call? That was the right ending for it?
It's totally subjective. I think in terms of how powerful the story is, and the fact that we're talking about it now makes me say, yeah, I thought the story I did was okay, but I don't think it would be as memorable. I mean, to my way of thinking, a character called Phoenix, it shouldn't be too surprising, when she dies and comes back to life.
That's true. You did start earlier than that issue, though. You started at 132, which is most famous for being the issue that ends with Wolverine coming out of the sewer. Us fans, that came out a year before I was born, so the way that I look at that was that the way that it's sold to me is that that's the moment that Wolverine became a superstar. Did you know at that moment when that panel
No, of
came?
course not. No, I remember thinking visually, how cool it looked. I think Byrne and Austin were doing incredible work. Everyone on that title, I think, looked at it as their opportunity to show what they can do. X-Men traditionally was throughout, since the beginning, sort of a poor selling title, hard to imagine now. And so, they had all these new people breaking into comics, Chris Claremont, John Byrne, Dave Cockrum. Dave had been probably in there the longest. And they were all just eager to show the world what they could do. And, it wasn't like you walk into a company and you're new and they say, well, here, you may do Spider-Man or the Fantastic Four, which is, I think John was hoping for the Fantastic Four,
Yeah.
which he eventually got to do, and I got to work with him on that. But with the X-Men, it was a good situation for all concerned, because at that particular time, the editors at the time, they were very protective of what they considered, the top sellers, like you don't want to rock the boat with Spider-Man or Fantastic Four, et cetera. Whereas, X-Men, that'll be canceled anytime. So they had a lot more freedom, which I think allowed for the creators to do some of their best work and have a lot of fun and create excitement. And it had a big impact on the audience. And I remember at one point, I think I was still assistant editor on the title, there was a group of fans in the UK who would vote on the Eagle Awards. Mm-hmm. And I thought, wow, the logo they had designed for the Eagle Awards and the name of it just sounded so prestigious and so important, and it looked so cool. The reality, it was like a bunch of, maybe 20 teenagers who were into comic books and they were enjoying. So I got to go over there, accept a bunch of awards for the X-Men. And one of the things I was very thankful to Roger Stern about when I was his assistant editor, he let me handle the covers. And I love working on the covers. And so it was an opportunity to post, on one of the covers, winner of 7 Eagle Awards, as if, it was the Oscars or something. It was, it's like if you and a few of your friends decided to have an award, but it would look so cool that later on, I think those same kids grew up and their taste changed, and they voted for Love and Rockets to get a majority of the awards. And I remember hearing publisher Gary Groth talking to the late Kim Thompson about, boy, we won all those Eagle Awards and the sales didn't go up. It was all smoke and mirrors. But I think the audience was passionate about it.
That's interesting. I did a study on like when I was back in college, I did a study on the sales of fiction books, on hardcover novels, and whether or not on what affected sales. And one of the things that I looked at was how many awards has this author won. It made no difference. It made no difference. It's interesting.
It's the whole Wizard of Oz thinking, it's like, whatever it is what it is. But to a lot of people, if you put an award, you put some special label on it, that gives it the seal of approval. Yeah. Okay, you may look at this. And I think in bookstore distribution, it's a factor, not so much in comic book shops, but if something, like the bookstores here will have sort of like a separate prominent location where it says the New York Times bestsellers. So, all things being equal, it's much better to be in that place.
Yeah.
I mean,
additional publicity.
Yeah, it's sort of ties in with what your research showed. The book sort of became bestsellers, and then, getting placed there, just perpetuated it, but it didn't create it. So it's a crazy thing. I would always be trying to study marketing and advertising and promotion, and so that it helps to the extent of getting awareness. If you're working on something that no one's ever heard of, that's about as tough a sell as you can imagine. If everyone knows and loves it, then you have a real advantage that you could build upon, and a lot of those marketing and promotion techniques do have some impact.
You have a higher base to start with. Chris Claremont and John Byrne, there's a lot of stories about those two working together. What can you tell us about their working relationship?
I like them both. I mean, it was interesting. They were over the years, I guess I developed something of a reputation of supposedly being able to work well with what some editors considered the difficult creators. I usually found out that translated into creators who were very passionate about what they were doing. And that's a pleasure to me. I mean, it's like if you go to work every day, you want it to be, particularly if you're in comics, you want it to be as enjoyable and as exciting, as fun as possible. So with the thinking being, at least as far as I'm concerned, if I'm not enjoying it, how can I really realistically expect anyone else to, So to be working on exciting projects with really talented creators, which both Chris and John and everyone associated with that title, including, the inker, the Terry Austin, Glynis Wein, the colorist, Tom Orzechowski, the letterer. I was a big believer, and still am, in that a lot of the early success of the Marvel comics in the 60s was, as a fan, if you liked a certain creative team for many years, you knew if you picked up the Fantastic Four, it was going to be by Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and later on Joe Sinnott, and and you knew what you were getting and you liked it. So the 70s, as Marvel was expanding rapidly, the 80s as well, there was a lot more turmoil and creators bouncing around, and things didn't really last. But I think a big part of what built, in addition to everything else, was the knowledge of the audience that if they liked the artwork, or if they liked the writing, or if they just liked the characters, they knew that this was something that was being consistent month after month. And, it was, and it's through that you could build word of mouth and, let your friends know, and it became a thing, and it was very exciting. And as far as the creators go, I liked working with both of them. John and I seemed to hit it off best. I think partially. No, I could easily have worked with either one going forward, but when you have that many creators with such strong egos, eventually it becomes when they become that passionate, well, I want to do things my way and I want to do things my way. And fortunately, Marvel had more than enough titles. So when John left the X-Men and he wanted to do the Fantastic Four, that worked out perfectly. We got along very well. He would joke and call me his trained editor, which I always considered ironic. Because I think I rejected more of his stuff than anyone else. But he was smart enough to take a long view. So a lot of the things I rejected, he got to do when the next editor took over. But I think, editing, as I approached it, and I'm sure others as well, you try to just create a relationship with your creators where they trust that you're trying to make them look as good as they can.
And when John Byrne also, I like to say this, if I were in the early 80s and I had to pick one writer and one artist for any random superhero book, and I don't know what that superhero book is, the writer I would pick is Roger Stern and the artist I would pick is John Byrne. And you actually put them together on a very short-lived run of Captain America. Can you tell me what happened there?
Things happen. I think what happened basically was, again, like there were a lot of editorial policies going on, and Jim Shooter was trying to create an overall throughout the line, more accessibility to the titles. A lot of titles, X-Men was a good example that it just, sometimes could seem like it was never ending, and if you hadn't read the previous 20 or so issues, you'd be lost and not know what was going on. And one of Jim's sort of quick fixes was to sort of request, let's have more one-part complete stories. And you could, if you have something really good, maybe it could be a two-parter. But don't even think about a three-parter unless it's like the Galactus trilogy that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby did, introduced the Silver Surfer and Galactus. And so I was taking that approach with it. I had no problem with anything they were doing. And if that didn't come down from Jim Shooter, I would have had probably no problem with what Roger and John were doing. But they wanted to do, I can't remember, it was probably a three-parter, but I think it was a two-parter. In my opinion, it was like, if I could go back in time, maybe I would whisper to myself and say, why don't you suggest to Roger and Stern that they just set aside this storyline and come up with another one-parter, or a few more one-parters, and then when Jim forgets about this, then we could do that story. But I think there were so many wheels turning and so much going on that that didn't seem like an option at the moment. So it was like, either we get to do this story this way, which they're entitled to do whatever they want, or we're gonna go. And I go, okay, I'm sorry. and that's basically what happened. They did great work. I think Joseph Rubinstein on the inks, did some, gave a different look to John's work from, say, the X-Men, which, he did quite a good job as well. Years and years later, Joe Rubinstein approached me, and he just sort of suddenly realized it. It had to be over 20 years later. He said, hey, when they quit, how come I left the book as well? I don't know. I can't remember, but they had more than enough other projects to do. So it all worked out well for everyone.
how much of editing and putting a team together, how much of it is a science and how much of it is intuition and gut feel?
And some of it is just sheer luck. A lot of it is based on, reality. I mean, like right now I'm at a company called Papercutz, and, we're nowhere near as big as Marvel or DC. So if I want to put a creative team together, it's not like I have my choice of anyone I want. But even when I was at Marvel, that wasn't quite true either. A lot of it depends on who's available. If they're doing something else, that you can't use them.
Yeah.
So a lot of it is just looking at whatever the talent pool is. And over the years, I've enjoyed the full range of the talent that was available. I would like a lot of the old timers, as they would call themselves. John Romita Sr., whatever disagreements he might have with me from time to time, he would always sort of say, Jim, I can't stay mad at you. You're the only one who uses the old timers, and, I just saw all these, like the talent pool as being aware of it as opportunities, and it's always like you're trying to match up what you think works best for a particular title. Sometimes you succeed, sometimes you don't. So there was the old timers, there were new people, there were, people, it's like the whole array. And I enjoyed that. Like the key thing for me, particularly at that period and going forward, is I enjoyed working with people who were just passionate about what they were doing. Occasionally you get some people who are just so talented, like some of the old pros, someone like John Buscema would say, "Oh, I hate this superhero stuff," but he was so good at it.
Just cranked it
out.
It
didn't matter. Yeah, he'd like get bored with whatever he was drawing on the front of the page, and just for his own amusement, he'd turn it over and draw something else that pleased him, made him happier. But it's a difficult job. Every aspect of it. So you're really looking for so many different things that there's really no one pat answer. You look for what you think is going to work. What people will get excited about. For example, later on, there was an artist during a period where some of Marvel's top talent in terms of artists was sort of leaving Marvel to go to DC, like Frank Miller and others. There was this young artist, Todd McFarlane, who saw that trend. He was at DC. He thought, well, maybe I should try going over to Marvel. And I remember it was Mark Grunwald, who was executive editor. He brought Todd to all the different editors to introduce him. And I think he got work from several of us. I think he did an issue of G.I. Joe. He did the Hulk. And it was funny because I had not too long before that had taken over the Spider-Man titles. And one of the things I had requested, and I have to give Jim Shooter credit again for allowing me to do this. I wasn't a big fan at the time of the black and white costume for Spider-Man, even though for a lot of fans at the time, that was the coolest thing. I thought
it's a cool costume, but not for Spider-Man.
I thought it was a great costume, maybe for a villain.
I see where this is going.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll say no more about that. But Jim Shooter was the one who really got that. He introduced it in Secret Wars and became a big thing in Spider-Man. And one of the things he wanted to do was keep it around a lot longer, past the point where people would think, oh, they're going to change back to, and then change back. So when I came to him, I said, I'd really rather go back to the red and blue. He could have very easily, and I would have listened to him, said, no, I want this black and white costume another 5 or 6 years, and it would have happened. But he said, look, you're the editor. That's what you want? Okay. And so I was happy about that. When Todd originally came in, you wouldn't recognize him, that Todd with the Todd McFarlane of today, in that he was a very soft-spoken guy. I remember he sat there with his head down. He had to like really, what's he saying? And so here, he was showing me his samples. He had photocopies of his pencils for, I think, Batman Year 2. Uh-huh. And he had done a beautiful job on it. But at DC, they gave it to another great artist, Alfredo Alcala, to do the inking. And Alfredo was used to, like, say, when he was working on Conan at Marvel, particularly the black and white Savage Sword of Conan, he took the pencils as if they were layouts. Yeah. And the finished artwork, he had this incredible, beautiful style and a lot of detail, and very influenced by a great painter known as Leyendecker. It was just incredible artist. But how it would end up, it would look like Alfredo Alcala.
I heard John Buscema was not happy about that.
Well, if you're drawing something, you sort of want it to look like your own work. But I think in Todd's case, he was very frustrated. I think he put a lot of work in. I mean, I think John Buscema was just doing layouts. So it made sense. I think it was a good decision, because it was a black and white magazine, and all that beautiful line work, which didn't look as great when it was colored in the comic books back then, but in black and white, it looked absolutely beautiful. But on Todd had worked, he did not layouts, but very tight pencils. All it needed was just Joe Average inker to just give us what was in the pencils, and it would have looked like something Todd did. So he felt, I put all this effort in, and no one could even see what I'm doing. So when I saw his pencil, I thought, oh, this is great. This is, Spider-Man was doing well already, but I thought, this is exciting. And so he didn't know I already got the okay to go back to the red and blue costume. So here's this new guy walking into Marvel, and he's saying, well, I only want to do Spider-Man if we have the red and blue costume back. And, okay, Todd, that's what it takes. We'll do it, So it worked out perfectly. And like, he was yet another artist I just totally enjoyed working with. I wish I had a recording of one of our early conversations where he was a very smart guy, still is. And he had sort of analyzed, he took his career very seriously, and he sort of analyzed like what the successful titles were, because he wanted to be incredibly successful. And in his mind, he didn't think at the time when he was starting that Spider-Man could ever possibly overtake the X-Men. And one of the reasons probably why Todd and I bonded is we're both, kind of competitive guys. And I was thinking at the time, having been involved with the X-Men before, kind of saw from the ground up how it, became so successful for so long. I felt if we were to do a lot of the same things with Spider-Man, it would work as well. And I remember, and a key thing was if we could just get regular creative teams and get everyone excited and do fun stuff, et cetera, and just stick with it. I remember telling him, I think it'll take us maybe 7 years, but I think we could do it. And then we wound up outselling the X-Men in just 3 years.
I want to get back to Todd in a bit because I figured that you figured that Todd McFarlane was going to come up at some point. But I just wanted to ask, Jim Shooter, deserved reputation or a bad rap?
It's all subjective again.
Yeah.
It depends. Like if you're working with someone who's your boss, and it's even more complicated in a creative field where there's, how do you define what's right and wrong?
You can't really quantify things.
It's tricky. So obviously the people who worked well with him think, what a great guy. And the people who would butt heads with him, had, like I could usually see, the different sides to it. And sometimes I was even able to, with certain, creators, even like lower down, behind the scenes type of stuff. There might have been a colorist who had worked at Marvel for many years and who had worked with Stan Lee, knew what Stan Lee wanted and wanted to do that. And most of the editors after Stan were absolutely happy with that. This guy knows what we want, because they were all pretty much following in the same Stan Lee tradition of editing and the same sense of, artistic style and direction. And when Jim took over, this colorist started, I liked him. He would be complaining, as all employees do at various times. This guy, he doesn't understand. Stan wanted it this way, blah, 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 blah. And he was like getting frustrated. He felt he was going to, get in trouble and, he might lose his job, who knows what. And I said to him, because he was a, smart guy, I said, look, Jim's the new boss. And one of the things about him that some editors are not as good as doing as well as Jim did, is articulating what he wanted. And particularly in something like coloring. I said, here's a crazy notion. Why don't you try listening to what he says, trying to do it the way he wants it, see what happens. Because this was a guy who was already an older guy. I don't think he was passionate per se about being in comics. I think he was concerned about having a regular job. And when he gave this a shot, I think he was surprised by how favorable Jim's reaction. Oh, now you got it. Now you're talking. That's what I was looking for. And this guy wasn't dumb. He was able to understand exactly what Jim was looking for, and he was able to do that. And that worked out fine for him. It's a lot trickier with writers and artists because a lot of times, a writer, an artist wants to be able to express themselves their own way. Mm-hmm. And the fact that so many were able to and continue to do so, speaks well of comics, but occasionally reality will, Marvel, for better or worse, is a company, and it has people in charge of deciding what you can and can't do. And sometimes these things change. And I think I totally embraced Marvel and grew up with the Marvel that Stan Lee was art director and editor. and I would go through these transitions, and I just sort of accepted, look, I'm the editor. He's the editor in chief. I will try my best to give him what he wants. And at the time, I mean, change is never fun, really, in that sense.
Yeah.
It was very difficult, and my learning curve was. But I really did learn a lot from him, because I think he was all about, trying to make Marvel as accessible and make the stories as good as possible, the art is, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of that's been incredibly helpful to me at Papercutz, where we are producing graphic novels for a young audience. And so clear storytelling, one-part stories, all that kind of stuff.
Fill people in on what they missed.
Yeah, but we hardly ever need to do that. A few series, yes, but it's in other words, it was important early on for Papercutz, places like libraries, which now they get lots of Papercutz books, that librarians would be able to look at our books, read them, and understand them. Now, it sounds crazy to some comic fans who have been reading comics and grew up with them, but there is a language to comics, and the more esoteric ones could be like, I don't know what I'm looking at, whereas we're looking at our books as always, for a young audience, for someone who may be picking up a graphic novel for the first time. We don't want them struggling to figure out, like it becomes too much work. So there's just a lot of comic book basics that sort of got lost along the way, that Jim fought very hard to bring back. And I think for the top talent, they didn't have any problems really sort of accommodating, like it didn't drive, ultimately you could argue it did, but Frank Miller was able to do a lot of great material when Jim Shooter was there. John Byrne and Chris Claremont did great stuff when, Walt Simonson, on and on. It was a lot of great stuff that was produced there. Sometimes you could even argue that kind of creative friction might even bring out the best. And some people want to just be left alone. I mean, even when, Stan Lee was working, developing the Marvel universe in the very beginning, not every artist, and one could argue, even the ones he was most successful with, later would, have reservations and, and think things didn't work out right. But early on, even there were people like Wally Wood. Mm-hmm. No, I can't work here. I can't work under these circumstances. So everyone has their own approach. And fortunately, the field is big enough these days that creators can find people who are happy to work with them, and it works out okay.
So it seems to me like he was a boss, and you either get along with the boss or you didn't.
I think he felt, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think he thought things were a bit more chaotic creatively, and he wanted to instill some more order.
Is that possible in a creative environment, in such a big creative environment?
I mean, I think he did to a certain, I mean, like, like one could take, say, you could look at an issue of Legion of Superheroes that Jim wrote and did layouts for, that Kurt Swan, illustrated, back at DC Comics. And I think you'd have a hard time finding someone who would say that the storytelling isn't clear, it's easy to understand, etc. You might have a harder time finding someone who thinks, wow, that artwork looks so dynamic and bold, and which I think, in a sense, sort of led to Image Comics,
Yeah.
where by Jim trying to push for such clarity, and I'm sure he could make a strong case, and a valid case, that it is possible to do both. Someone like John Byrne or Walt Simonson and Frank Miller are examples that you could have great art and it could still be easy to understand.
Like
But
George
there are some who,
Alan Davis, George Perez. That's
yeah,
cool.
oh yeah.
Yeah.
There was it's a tricky thing. There's just some, different approaches. I mean, one could look at some of the Image Comics, and back in the day. Now they even evolved where, they're not as extreme as they once were. Where like there was a lot of they were going for cool looking stuff versus clear storytelling, and even the name of the company was making it clear that they were just going for cool looking stuff.
Image.
Maybe not the deepest storylines, which is not to say Marvel or DC's stories back then were the best thing in the world, but it was an attempt. It's interesting. Recently, I've done some introductions to some old Avengers issues for Marvel's Masterworks. Marvel got me to write some introductions, so I'm back after all these years. And at first, I think one volume was Avengers, and this is stuff I done so long ago. I was like thinking, what am I going to write? I can't remember. But they sent me a PDF of the material, and I looked at it, and I had like new appreciation for it. And not to put down any of the artists who worked on the stuff, but some of Jim Shooter's storylines, I felt if they had artists the caliber of Miller or Simonson, they would be considered the same way we were talking about Dark Phoenix. Some of the material he did with Yellow Jacket, Hank Pym, they were incredibly great stories. But to use an extreme comparison, it's almost as if you take a Shakespeare play and you give it to the world's greatest actors and they perform it, it's wonderful. If you take that same play and you give it to, like, say, a third grade class, and they're not,
it's not
really
going to happen.
The words will be exactly the same. The script is exactly the same, but there's so much that it takes to really, pull these things to life. I was even reading an interview, say, with J.M. DeMatteis, excuse me, regarding Kraven's Last Hunt, and he did the script for it, but he gives when they ask him, why do you think it's still thought of so highly, he doesn't hesitate to give a lot of credit to Mike Zeck,
yeah,
who he feels it could have been the exact same script, but if a different artist did it, it wouldn't be what it is.
Oh no, if somebody of a lesser caliber than Mike Zeck did it, it would be criticized for being so off-brand for Spider-Man.
Exactly.
But it's the work of Mike Zeck's life.
Yeah, so it's one of these things. I mean, Jim and his back to Jim Shooter again. I mean, like, in his own way, he was the editor-in-chief. There were a couple of issues that were, outstanding, that he worked with this artist, Alan Weiss.
Yeah.
And it was a really excellent story. But I think what happened was, and it goes back to what I was saying about having regular creative teams, I think in that volume I wrote the introduction for, there was always, here's this artist, here's the new team, then they're gone, here's a fill-in, here's another fill-in. It was just very chaotic. And a lot of the stuff that would make X-Men work is all, it's like a lot of, it's what the Marvel cinematic universe is. It's almost like these superhero soap operas.
Yeah.
And when you have that flow from issue to issue, and you just can't wait to see what happens next, that usually generates a lot of excitement and makes the book a hit. When it's constantly start and stop. Well, here's a great story, and if someone enjoys it and they come back and it's a fill-in, then another fill-in, it's like, so it's very challenging. It's not an easy thing to do, but when it does come together and you get the right team, usually works out well.
So would you advocate, especially in the days of, these days that the trade paperbacks are out and everything, would you advocate more for if an artist is late on something, on getting a fill-in to finish the book, or to just let him finish the book and wait for it to be finished?
It all depends again. I mean, on some things you don't have a choice. If something is a monthly title, you have to come out every month. Just the way that works. But even when I was at Marvel, there would be other types of things that would, like they'd want to have a Spider-Man graphic novel, say. Yeah. And one of the ones I worked on was written and illustrated by Charles Vess.
Yes,
who's an incredibly good artist. And I remember really wanting to see him, do, his all out, usual great job, down to doing the color and everything. And, the reality is that doing comics is a lot of work. And particularly he put a lot into it. And at one point, I think he came in, and my assistant knew how much I was looking forward to him doing the color as well. And he said, I'm just worn out. I've been working on this so long. And, what had happened was because he was putting so much into it, it was taking a long time, but because it was Spider-Man, because, it can't come out. I could easily shove in another Spider-Man graphic novel and we'll give you all the time you need. But so fortunately I was able to convince him to go ahead and do the color. And I think he's happy it worked out that way as well. So where there's room to maneuver, you have a character that's, going to be selling now, 10 years from now, you have a little bit more flexibility. A lot of new material we do at Papercutz, for example, is creator owned. And your hands are sort of tied there where, if they own the property and if they can't get the next one done in time, I can't assign a fill-in. Yeah. So we're at the mercy of the creators there. But with the ongoing series, I think, over the years, I was mostly very lucky. I had a lot of guys that were, on time, and, the only thing, reality, sometimes someone gets sick, something happens, what are you going to do? But for the most part, I think once we would get going, we would manage to avoid fill-ins for the most part, and do everything we could to keep the regular creators on.
Kind of a last resort, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, like if it looked like we knew ahead of time, like maybe we would, be able to have, maybe the same writer would be able to continue. And we would just have a couple of fill-in artists. And we would try to find people who were, like when Todd couldn't do every issue, he would recommend Eric Larson, who then went on to take over after Todd. So it wasn't as, disruptive. But it's challenging. The worst thing that happens, sometimes new creators do this. No one wants to admit they can't do something. And sometimes if editors are calling, they don't want to answer the phone, or, it's the worst thing they could do is to sort of, stop communicating. And whereas
they don't want to admit it. They don't want to admit they're going to be late.
Whereas sometimes the best thing is just to say, look, I'm not sure I could handle this next month, because also they're afraid, maybe they'll lose the assignment or what have you. So there's a lot of factors that go into it. So, but, to me, it was more important to always try to make the comics as good as possible. There would sometimes be other editors who would point out, I've never missed a deadline, every issue on time. And I'd look at the sales figures and they weren't all that great, So sometimes some of the best-selling stuff or the most exciting things in comics were, unfortunately, notoriously late. Watchmen, I don't know how many, that took a long time to come out originally when it was a series. But, and that's why I considered someone like John Byrne, who was able to produce a couple of monthly titles.
There's 2 books a month. And they look
He was
good.
like a machine. And like, I can never understand why editors would not fully appreciate how lucky they would have to have a resource like him. If you're a company that's doing monthly comic books, you should be very thankful if you have someone like John Byrne.
Speaking of sales, when you took over Spider-Man, it was pretty much at around the time that they married him off. Where did you stand on the wedding?
I was the one who married him off, so I was there before that. Well, lots of times things don't go exactly the way you plan. What happened was, when I took over, I hadn't really been paying too much attention to what was going on in Spider-Man. And I knew we needed to do some things to make it interesting and, capture an audience. Regarding the wedding, there's a classic case of miscommunication. What had happened is Stan Lee had wanted to marry them in the syndicated Spider-Man newspaper strip. And he called Jim Shooter, the editor-in-chief, to, see if this could be coordinated. And I think Jim literally had asked me in the hallway, what do you think of, Peter and Mary Jane getting married? I thought, that'd be great. What I forgot is Stan Lee, it works in his favor. He's one of the most impatient guys in the world. So when he asked a question, he took that as, we're going to do this now. I took it as, there are so many series that would take years to milk a storyline like, will he get married? Won't he? What's going to happen? Et cetera, et cetera. So we sort of were blithely continuing, assuming like maybe there'll be a meeting at some point where we'll figure this out, we'll plot the course, how we might be able to do it. The next thing I knew, Jim Shooter was saying, well, it's happening in June.
Got to do it in the annual.
And we had to like pull titles, issues that we were already done to back, to set it up, that were all sort of last minute affairs. And
So all the
and it
stuff with
was
the proposal and everything that was kind of like put in at the last minute.
it was
Oh wow.
I mean, fortunately, the deadline for the comic strip is there's longer lead time.
Mm-hmm.
So we may have had, or like while they were working on it for the comic strip, it may not appear until half a year to a year later, whereas in the comics they would appear 3 months later. So that gave us a little bit of a cushion, and we just had to throw things out and suddenly put it in. Like Mary Jane was virtually no longer in the comics at that point, and so it was very abrupt. And
I always thought it was weird because he had just broken up with a black cat.
Yeah, well, yeah. I had my own issues with that character as well.
Really?
A lot of fans love the character. To me, it was I always thought it was way too close to Catwoman, and my approach to editing is particularly back then in the 80s, where the trend was sort of, in 86 there was so much success with Dark Knight, Watchmen. The trend was, let's all make the characters grimmer, darker. And I did wind up editing one of the darkest Spider-Man stories ever with Kraven's Last Hunt. But overall, I don't think any character should try to imitate any other character. It should be as much, Spider-Man should be as much as Spider-Man as possible. I didn't want him to be a second-rate Daredevil or Batman. So it was, we were looking for opportunities to reinforce who Spider-Man was. And like the marriage seemed to be something to shake things up. And, it's one of those things you try to do the best you can at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But if I had it to do over again, I think it would have been a lot longer build up, as opposed to like, oh, we're getting married.
Some people get married right away. It happens.
There's all sorts of things.
So this issue was written by Jim Shooter, edited by you, but Jim Shooter was the editor-in-chief. How is a working relationship like on a setup like that?
Well, I think Michelini scripted it. It was a similar. We did Avengers similarly. Jim would say, "Well, you're the editor." Well, yes, technically, but you're my boss. So it's a delicate thing. But generally, I usually, it's almost like I have a greater appreciation of his writing now than maybe I did at the time, because a lot of, I grew up with very much in the Stan Lee, approach, and which is not, it's not contradictory to Jim's approach, but he did some really good stuff, and I think that the problem with was, I don't think Jim often had the caliber of artists to match his stories. So even though the stories were there, and there are lots of fans of it who are more writing conscious and, don't places, whereas the fans who are more into what the imagery looks like, they tend to, what did Jim Shooter ever do? Whereas the ones who are more into the writing, a lot of his stuff had a lot of impact and would make a lot of sense. And was very strong and holds up pretty well these days, even if in some cases the artwork doesn't.
How do you feel about Kraven's Last Hunt now?
I liked it then. I have to give it was something that was actually in the works before I took over. Jim Owsley, now Christopher Priest, was the Spider-Man editor when that first got assigned. And there's probably 3 things I really did as editor on that, which Mark gives me a lot of credit for. It wasn't called Kraven's Last Hunt, which was my title, until we did the trade paperback.
Mm-hmm.
Because it would have been a dead giveaway what the ending might be. But he had a much more poetic title, which I can't think of right now, which was good. And the other thing I did, because I think the other thing I couldn't get Marvel to go along with ever, was I thought there should only be one Spider-Man title. And if they wanted one Spider-Man comic a week, well, let's make it weekly. Let's have Amazing Spider-Man be a weekly comic. So with Kraven's Last Hunt, my thinking was, because I really disliked it, like say he was buried alive in Spectacular Spider-Man, and next week Web of Spider-Man comes out, and he's just swinging around as if nothing happened. And there's a footnote, well, this takes place before, or even worse, after the, what's going on in the other title. To me, it lost, for it to have as much impact as possible, it had to be 1 week after the other. And the opportunity arose to do it when there was a transition in editors-in-chief, where Jim was leaving, Tom DeFalco was coming in. They had, Tom had so much to do to, just to, like get his bearings on things. So I took advantage of that and just had the story continue through all 3, Spider-Man titles. And everything I did, even after that, even with the logos, I tried to make them all look like the Amazing Spider-Man logo. And I just wanted, it was important to me that Spider-Man was one guy. Now, of course, there's a whole Spider-Verse, but at the time, I just wanted the Peter Parker Spider-Man to be the guy, no matter which book you picked up, you felt, it was an interesting approach before, like they may have thought, well, we'll have his personal life in this book. We'll have him, do team ups in this book. This one will be at in college, and this one will be at the Bugle. I felt you had to keep it all together, that's what made Spider-Man Spider-Man to me.
That's what the intent for launching Spectacular was back in the 70s. And I never actually felt, because I read it in the letters page that this was the intent. It was supposed to be his personal life, but I never really felt it when I was reading Amazing.
Particularly if they're going to be supervillains.
Especially if they're going to be supervillains. And then Todd McFarlane, like, what was the reaction of other artists and other editors like when, did you know he was going to be this big? Like,
No, but
did it get to a point where you realized he was going to be this big eventually?
Yeah, well, the thing that was interesting was and going backwards for a while, I've sort of been associated with Spider-Man over the years in all sorts of different ways. And one of the major things I did first was writing Spidey super stories, which I think in some ways was detrimental to the character. It gave the company a lot of great public relations. Here's comics that could be used as a tool to help kids learn how to read, etc. but I think kids are very sensitive, like when, say up to age 12, of doing what they think is age appropriate. In other words, if something becomes considered like what a kid would call a baby property, like there's, well, they wouldn't call it a property, but a baby book. Oh, Spider-Man, that's for little kids. You're going to lose them. And I think doing a Spidey Super Stories, even though I to this day, I still meet people in the business who became comic book writers who say that's the first comic they ever read. So I'm thrilled by that. But I think at the time, it may have hurt Spider-Man. And for many years, Spider-Man was sticking, long after John Romita Sr. had left the book, to sort of his version. It's almost as if the artists weren't drawing a character who was Spider-Man. They were drawing pictures of John Romita's Spider-Man in somewhat their own style. And it was just so much of it. Not to say it wasn't good, but I think in terms of having an impact on the audience, something that I didn't like, as I mentioned before, was the black and white costume. But I think the impact it had was, particularly with younger readers, like, oh, you read Spider-Man, that silly, kitty comic? Where no, this is Spider-Man with the black and white costume. This is far more sophisticated than, an 11-year-old like myself would be caught dead reading Spidey Super Stories. So I sort of endangered the whole thing by going back to the blue and red costume. But I think when Todd came along, Todd has a brilliant mind, and he has great insights to how, kids look at things. He really understood the cool factor.
Yeah.
And a lot of what he may not be, and who cares, in my opinion, he may not be the best at anatomy. He wasn't trying.
I don't think he cared.
Spider-Man. Yeah. He was trying to make him as spidery as possible. In his mind, he was trying to do a combination of the power and dynamics of Jack Kirby, along with the moodiness and creepiness of Steve Ditko, and it was sort of based on his memory of what he thought that looked like. And I remember him telling me at one point, he actually looked at some of their old stuff and said, oh, that's not how I remember it looking. But, and he gives credit to, like, he took a little bit from here, a little bit, there was a portfolio, an art portfolio that was published of Michael Golden's work. And he was the first one to draw the Spider-Man's webbing the way he did. And then Todd said, "Ooh, he had that. Oh, that's cool." And everything he did, the poses and the contortions, the layouts, was it just created a huge fascination with the character. It was like recreating something that you had seen a million times and looked sort of like, yeah, that's Spider-Man. And wait, this is, that's not an easy thing to do. I mean, it's still, he made the eyes bigger, he added more webs, et cetera, et cetera. But, and then there was some pressure against that, oh, he shouldn't be drawing it that way, get him to, conform with how we do Spider-Man around here. And I wasn't particularly keen on that concept, but hey, if I'm being told that by my boss, let me see what I could do about it. And I had a lunch meeting with Todd and his wife, Wanda, and my assistant, Glenn Herdling, who was an excellent assistant. And they were all on Todd's side. And it was just me against them during this lunch.
It doesn't even sound like you were on your side during this lunch.
I know. I think from my point of view, my concern I think what I was going for was making it all one character.
Okay.
And in a weird way, this was making it someone else was an amazing, who looked completely different. So we sort of went down the list, and Todd was, had very convincing arguments, I do the eyes to make him more like a bug. Like it was all okay. I see I see how that works. I see this. I see that. I do the webbing. He tried to explain it to me in a pseudo-scientific way, but I said, no, you're doing it because it just looks cooler that way. And I bought into all that. They were very convincing. And what took Todd aback was I still wanted to address my own concerns. And I said, well, now I'm going to have to talk to the other Spider-Man artists. And I want it to all look like this Spider-Man. So it was like Sal Buscema and Todd was like, he felt terrible. He thought, oh, no, I don't want you to tell them to start drawing like me. And I had to clarify, no, I don't want them to draw in your style. They could draw their own style. But imagine, there are movies now with the Spider-Man in it. And it's like, if his costume has big eyes and more web, more black or blue,
but in their own style,
draw that guy. I want him to look like the same guy in all the books. It could be drawn in different artistic styles, but if you're drawing, there were a lot of things we wanted to make look consistent. We didn't want the Daily Bugle building, for example, to look one way in one book and look another in another. When there was a bunch of details that defined who the characters were, et cetera, and we wanted that to be consistent, and we went ahead and did it. And as the sales on all the Spider-Man books were increasing, suddenly there wasn't as much pressure to change it.
How did Sal in particular take it? Because he had been drawing Spider-Man at that point for almost 15
He
years.
was very involved. Excuse me. He I think one of the many good things that happened during Jim Shooter's time as editor-in-chief is creators began getting royalties. So I think Sal was, he previously, in order to kind of make the income he wanted to make, had to lay out almost a book a week. And it was a killer thing. This, I think on Spider-Man, he was probably still doing other stuff, but I think he felt he could put a little bit more of himself. We got him to, I always try to get the artist to do as much as possible. You saw that on going back to the Fantastic Four, where John wound up inking himself before he, as he would have admitted, I don't know how to ink, and you sort of saw it in progress. And the same thing happened on Amazing, where after what Todd had gone through with Alfredo Alcala, a lot of times what happens is the inkers with the absolute best intentions would think, well, look at all these drawing mistakes. I'll fix it up. I'll make them look better.
And
they don't
always
realize
best when he inks himself.
Well, when he was complaining about it, he was hoping, well, maybe you could get me Terry Austin. And I tried, and he was busy. But I said, look, why don't you ink it yourself? Then you have no one to complain about. And he took that challenge. And I remember he had to call up other artist friends and what pens do I need? And he jumped into it. And I think that started the whole process. So the same thing was going on even with Sal Buscema. He was invested, if there's, if I could benefit off the success of the title, I want it to look as good as I could possibly make it. And it was a benefit for those guys who knew how to ink as well, because they didn't have to do as, super tight pencils. They could sort of finish the drawing in their inks. And that usually, made it work out well for them. And when the royalties came around, they weren't just getting the pencilers royalty, they were getting the pencilers and the inkers royalty. And I think they were all very happy about it. I don't think there was any resistance, because again, I wasn't telling them draw like Todd. I was just sort of as if I was giving them a new model sheet. Here's what the Spider-Man costume looks like. When he shoots his webs, it looks like this. And they were like, fine, and here's what Mary Jane's hairstyle is right now.
So it was
So
like, don't draw like Todd, draw your style, but you're drawing Todd's version.
Yeah,
kind of, yeah.
yeah. It would happen. It's just a matter of because in the 3 titles, it would have been crazy if J. Jonah Jameson, for example, had a full beard in one title, and then the other one he still has his little Hitler mustache, and the other one he's clean shaven. It's like, no, this is how the guy looks. Draw him in your own style, but he has to have these certain things. And through talking with people like or such as Stan Lee or even John Romita Sr., they would give me the information I knew help make the characters distinctive, no matter how the characters would change. For example, someone like Mary Jane, she had a cleft in her chin, she had dimples, and she had arched eyebrows. That was Mary Jane. A lot of artists sometimes they have trouble distinguishing the characters. They have their way of drawing them. They're having to produce stuff so fast that it was key to make sure they all had specific looks, characteristics that made them unique and would stand out, so there would be no problem knowing who was who.
Can you pinpoint the exact moment the Spider-Man books sales started to skyrocket, or was it a slow but steady build?
It was slow, and but it was also one of the things that I like, because I didn't want it to just be amazing. I wanted it to be all the Spider-Man titles. I remember at the time I almost didn't think of myself as an editor. It was as if Spider-Man was a celebrity and I was his manager. So I wanted each of his titles to succeed. And one of the things I liked a lot that happened is back in the day, like late night talk shows, one of the things comedians would like is if they were a guest and they were doing their stand-up act, if they could get the band to laugh, they felt, I really did something, good. Because the bands don't even pay attention to most of the guests. They're just focused on providing the music in and out of commercials. But if they suddenly are like, hey, this guy's funny, it was like a special achievement. A similar thing existed in comics, where they had a production bullpen where they had a lot of people who would do the art and lettering corrections, back on the original artwork back in the pre-computer days, and they saw everything. Every day all the comics would go past them. And I remembered we were doing a storyline in Spectacular Spider-Man with Jerry Conway, who we were able to get back, who had, one of the writers, one of the first few writers after Stan Lee to write Spider-Man.
Killed
writing
Gwen
it with
Stacy.
Sal.
Killed Gwen Stacy.
Well,
Bit of an
he did a
understatement.
lot of other things
Yeah.
as well. But he came up with this character, Tombstone,
Yeah.
which actually started in Web, but then most of his storyline picked up in Spectacular. And it was this storyline where it was involving Joe Robertson, who for many, many years, except for a story every now and then, his whole role would be to be smoking a pipe and say, hey, Jonah, give the kid a break. And
Jonah's
just to sort of,
conscience. That was it.
yeah, that. So to suddenly be doing a storyline where this villain tied into Robertson, and there were all these things happening, very soap opera like, where suddenly, there's going to be a trial, Robertson's been arrested, it'll probably be resolved right away. And suddenly, they were coming in, the guys who were working on this were actually reading that storyline. And they came in and they didn't ask about anything else. And they go, Robbie's not going to go to prison, is he? I can't tell. And he did. And that was shocking to them. So there was and I think Tombstone again, even though I think Alex, who designed a character, and Sal Buscema did a great job on it, I don't think we ever used it. I don't think Todd ever drew that character.
I don't recall.
But I think if Todd had, it would have elevated the character even more. But yeah, he's still around.
Yep. Spider-Man #1 was I have the 5th printing of that book. It's 5th printings. That is insane. That's an insane thing. But
when I proposed it, Marvel was going through yet another transition where I had been there a long time. I started when I was 15 years old, and from the bottom up, and it was even when, like, back in the days when Stan Lee was still there, and John Romita, Herb Trimpe, Marie Severin, etc. And to me, it was like these were my comic book gods, and I couldn't believe how lucky I was to be there. And I would just try to soak it all in, but they were incredibly informal. Everyone called Stan. He wasn't Mr. Lee or anything like that. And it was just a fun place to be at. And when I think Ron Perlman took over, they were trying to become a little bit more corporate. But for example, how it was changing, I didn't always agree with Jim Shooter. There was a time I think he fired me a couple of times, but I think I had the distinction of one of the few people he would actually hired back. And I think a lot was because I didn't take it personally, and in this case, Jim was, now I lost my train of thought. We were just talking about
Spider-Man #1. But
exactly. When I was working with Shooter, all I ever had to do, either catch him in the hallway, go into his office, and pitch an idea. And it was yes or no. And I didn't mind, if it was a no. The place was so creative. There was always things, if we can't do that, what about this? And, I get a lot of yeses, I get a lot of no's. That's fine. I was happy. I got enough yeses that I was happy. When I was, when it came to me, that Todd, because I sort of started the process, when he complained about the, I want to, the inking is not how I like it to be. And I suggested you should ink it yourself. If you take this to its natural progression, even though he had nothing against David Michelinie, he was beginning to think, maybe I could write, something, and be totally invested in whatever I'm doing. And, he wasn't, he was in a position where theoretically he could have said, I wouldn't have gone along with it. Why don't you get rid of this writer? And, I'm obviously the one who's selling this book. He was not at all like that. And what he expected, honestly, what he was talking about is, Jim, this has been great, working on amazing, but I think I got to go, to the next level for myself. And I think that would be writing and my own stuff. I said, I understand. And it took me a while to remember something. There was a point where, Todd, again, really paid attention to everything. And at times, I think I had been at Marvel so long that it's easy to stop questioning and you just sort of feel, well, that's just the way we do things. Mm-hmm. So his fresh perspective was helpful to me. And what I meant specifically, he'd put all this work in, he's inking it, penciling, and the books would come out and he'd go, this printing's crap. And he'd look at what Marvel was doing at Epic and he'd ask, well, how come their books look so great? And Spider-Man, you think that's the top book? Don't you want it to be look as good as possible? And I thought that's a good question. Let me, I didn't know the answer. Let me look into this. And there was a great person who was the head of the direct sales market at that time, Carol Kalish.
Yeah.
So I figured I'd check with her. What's the story on this? How come those Epic books look so good? And our books are, printed on toilet paper, which, by the way, I wrote the Marvel toilet paper.
You did.
And, so Carol had a very good, clear answer. At the time, a lot of Marvel's titles were still sold on newsstands. And one of the things Marvel wanted to do to maintain that large audience was to keep the price point, the price of the comics as low as possible so kids could afford it. And that meant,
cheaper paper.
Going with the cheapest possible printing, whereas the Epic titles were only sold in the comic book stores on a direct sales basis, where they could be more expensive, they could have better paper, they could have better printing. So that sort of satisfied me. Oh, okay. And she explained, we want Spider-Man to be as successful as possible, have every kid be able to afford to buy it. So that's why we want to keep the price down on it. And I was, okay, I get it. And I think as I was walking away, Carol said, well, if you want to do another Spider-Man title in the better format, and at that point, I was still in the mindset of, I wish there was only one Spider-Man title, even if it was weekly. The last thing I wanted to do was come up with a fourth title at that point. But then things change. When I was in a situation where Todd wanted to move on, I certainly didn't want to hold him back. And he was very honest and sincere. He felt, I'll write some backup strips. I'll do some 10th rate title, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the public perception was that somehow, because Todd was so successful, that Marvel gave him his own book. The reality was, once he made it clear, he was thinking of leaving Amazing, then like every editor in the business wanted to have, Todd McFarlane doing one of their titles. And I enjoyed working with him. And then, it took me a while. That's something I remembered that conversation with Carol, and I thought, wait a minute. And there was another factor involved, and there was an increase in demand for trade paperback collections.
Uh-huh.
And one of the things that was difficult with the Spider-Man titles, because the stories were so continuous, that they would, someone would buy a whole book of Spider-Man stories, and they sort of start in the middle of a story and maybe end
in the middle of another.
So I thought, well, wait, here I could solve a couple of problems here. We could do a fourth title that's almost designed for the trade paperbacks, where we could do 6-part stories. Todd could write, draw, do the whole thing. Doesn't have to directly tie in. It could be, the story itself could fit in somewhere, but it won't be that weekly thing I was hoping for. And that's all I was thinking of. And I think Todd was very surprised, and there, and he agreed to do it. And I said, "Don't worry, I'm here for you. I'll and we really had no idea it was going to be as big as it was, and a lot of it was, my thinking was, from working with Todd, is I felt I could go to anyone in the business, tell them, write the dullest page of script. If I give that page to Todd, he's going to make it look like the most interesting thing, the most exciting, dramatic, comic being published. So I felt, since we had all this momentum and things were going so well with these titles, I figured, an all new Spider-Man title would be a lot of fun to do. And I just had a lot of fun in regards to everything around it. I came up with the title.
Spider-Man.
Yes, I would go up to everyone I would meet for weeks and say, what do you think the new Spider-Man title would be? And they, because everyone's trained to, think that we just do the same things over and over. Oh, the Astonishing Spider-Man, the nope. And they, well, what are you going to call it? Spider-Man. It would be shocked. Just Spider-Man? Yeah.
Adjectiveless.
So there was so many things, and this is where luck also. One of the things that sort of irks me these days, and I'll occasionally, not often, I'm able to restrain myself because it really doesn't matter. But sometimes people are very dismissive of the success of that title, not recognizing how much, the buildup to that, how much real, they just would sometimes dismiss it. Oh, it's just a novelty. There were so many different, there weren't, there were essentially 2 originally, and others that came after it were, one of them was like free, given to stores for selling so many. And one thing that's always forgotten is that the Rec Sales edition of it was limited. We told, you could,
yeah.
I thought it was a joke. I mean, this was a big number back then. They could only get, I'm not sure, it was there was a version of it that was limited to just 250,000 copies. And regarding luck and all that, I got into a big battle with Marvel's head, PR person at the time. And, they would do more company, good, positive, type of puff stories, oh, Marvel characters are at the White House Easter egg hunt, that kind of thing was their story. And I was told, it's not news that we're coming out with another Spider-Man story, which I was like, we're not even going to try to publicize this. And so I was determined and kind of fearless at that point, and went over that person's head. And I said, and they said, go ahead, you write the press release and we'll get it out there. And back then, newspapers were even still a big deal.
Yeah.
And the Daily News, which was the highest circulation daily newspaper in the country at the time, that week when Spider-Man #1 came out, did 3 separate stories on it, about how successful it was, et cetera, et cetera. There was, so that same person, it was like all this behind the scenes craziness where the book's out, it's a big hit, it's taken everyone by surprise. The sales are like nothing anyone's seen in comics for years. And what happened is, I remember it was a lunch hour. As usual, I was still at my desk working, and there was a company policy as they were becoming more corporate, and I have no problem with this policy. Is like, if anyone from the media was to call, you're to refer them to the PR person. And so I got a call from CBS This Morning, their morning version of the Today Show and Good Morning America.
Yeah. And
they wanted to have someone from Marvel to talk about this Spider-Man, comic. They already, Stan was at that time in LA. He already agreed to be on it, and they wanted me. So I said, I got to, I can't talk to you. You have to talk to the PR person. She was out to lunch. We got to do this right away. We need this. And I said, well, hold on, let me see what I could do. So I went to the editor-in-chief wasn't there, but Mark Grunwald, the executive editor, was there. So I said, Mark, what should I do? They want me to do this. And he said, do you want to do it? I said, I'll be happy to do it, sure. And so I got back on, and Mark said, go ahead, do it then. I agreed to do it. After lunch, the PR person comes in.
Oh,
and she's yelling at me. How can you have agreed? Why would you do? This is the person who said it wasn't a story, no one would care about a new Spider-Man comic. And she's upset that I agreed to do CBS This Morning. I should have held out, for the Today Show or Good Morning America. And I didn't do this often, but I was just so upset. I said, fine, I won't do it then. And and she realized what happened. And I think her bosses made her come back to apologize to me, so I would do it. But and what happened the next day, this was at a period where David Letterman had just gone to CBS, and his ratings were very hot. And when people still had dials on their television, so when they would go to sleep, they would leave it on whatever show they watched. And the next morning, Kuwait was invaded.
Oh, okay.
And everyone turned on, was like, oh, they turned the TV on. There's a war somewhere. And there's Stan Lee and me talking to Paula Zahn about a new Spider-Man comic. And I can't remember his name right now, but even after our segment, the weatherman was excited about it. And he was saying, oh, yeah. So it was just this, momentum that people who may not have even been following comics before, or maybe they did in the 60s, but they dropped out. And this was like, hey, there's something new. And there's Stan Lee saying there's a new, who cares about me? Saying there's a new Spider-Man #1. So yeah, you got some people who are speculators who buy multiple copies. But I remember in New York City at the time, some of the biggest stores like Forbidden Planet had limits, you could only get 2 copies, and there were lines. And it was like really spider mania. So we loved it. And I think for me, I had been at Marvel close to 20 years at that point, and I was getting to a point where it was like my like a lab for where I could do these experiments to see what would happen using Marvel's money. Like, can I create a successful title? Can I do all these things? And can I test out my crackpot theories and see if they work? And it worked out well. So after a while, it's sort of like, what do you do after that? So I think Todd's plan was, get the other top artists at Marvel to leave with him and start Image Comics. Whereas I didn't really want to be editor-in-chief at Marvel, because a lot of that was, administrative, high pressure. Jim Shooter was able to, do a lot of creative stuff, but he worked really hard on so much other things. And as I said, the company was becoming more corporate. So it seemed like after the success of that comic, it was, it sort of raised my profile, and there were opportunities coming my way. And, if you're at a company, as much as I loved Marvel and still do, if you're there like 20 years, like I was, it's normal to sort of, take you for granted, and I felt maybe now it's time to move on and try other things. And that's what happened for me, as well as Todd and the gang.
And what you ended up in for the longest time, up to now, you founded in 2005 Papercutz.
No, well, from Marvel, I went to Topps Comics with at the Topps company, where our first title was a movie adaptation of the Dracula Francis Ford Coppola movie that Mike Mignola did, and I got to do a lot of things, that I enjoyed as well. And after Topps, I worked with Stan Lee again at Stan Lee Media, and then finally,
what's it like being evil Stan Lee?
Great. And he was my hero, still is one of my heroes. And I thought, when I, as a young kid, a fan, it was unimaginable that I would ever consider leaving Marvel. And again, it wasn't really necessarily anything I had against Marvel. I think there was only so many things that I was interested in doing. And once you sort of done them all, well, you're looking for new challenges, just like I think, and I think the success we had sort of gave us all a lot of confidence, Todd was a totally different person from that.
It's the same. It's the same with Stan, right? Stan was always looking for something new to do. And
it was great. I mean, I thought, I knew, fortunately, everything was still in New York City at that point. So I thought, I'll still see my friends, and, it won't be so bad. But Stan was already out in California for about 10 years. And I figured, I got to, even when he wasn't writing comics anymore, he did some Spider-Man annuals for me. When I was editing Marvel Age for about 8 years, and even when they dropped the soapbox from the bullpen bulletins page and all the comics, I got him to write a regular Stan soapbox for Marvel Age. So every month I was guaranteed a call, work it out with Stan, and it was just great. And I really, that was my one regret, was, I guess I won't be able to work with Stan anymore. And at Topps, I was able to do the Kirbyverse, where I got, like, it's
That's-
almost like the Marvel I grew up with wasn't really the Marvel I started working for.
Yeah.
Stan was still there, but I was able to work at Topps with Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, Don Heck, Dick Ayers, et cetera, Roy Thomas, Jerry Conway. The one guy I couldn't get was Stan, because he was still under exclusive contract with Marvel. So I figured, darn. But
if he wasn't, do you think you'd have been able to get him, considering the relationship
yeah.
he had with Jack and Steve? And
yeah, no, I was in a meeting before, one of the greatest moments for the fanboy in me before I left Marvel. There was, because internally at Marvel, they knew I had a pretty good relationship with Stan. Then when they were thinking about doing some kind of Stan line of comics, they thought, well, Jim could work on this. And, and I thought, how silly is that? And like, Stan didn't need my help originally. And to have an editor-in-chief and an editor and Stan, it seemed silly, but hey, I love working with Stan. I'll go along with it. And one of this, Stan had came up with the character that ultimately turned into Ravage. And early on, Tom DeFalco, who was the editor-in-chief, was, suggesting artists, which was great. I mean, Tom was aware that certain artists weren't getting as much work, and to him, these were real Marvel guys who deserved to be busy. But at the same time, Stan was thinking of this character as a Judge Dredd type of dark, and he would have loved Brian Bolland. That would have been his ideal choice. But instead, Tom had suggested Herb Trimpe, and Stan loves Herb Trimpe's work, but it just wasn't who he was looking for at that time. And then Tom mentioned Steve Ditko, who, even though he didn't want to do, he was back at Marvel, he was doing all sorts of stuff, ROM, etc. He'd even done a couple of stories for me in the Spider-Man annuals. We did, because I was able to use other characters as little backups.
because he wouldn't draw Spider-Man himself, right?
Right. So how can I work with this guy? All I'm editing are Spider-Man titles. And but he was happy to do an Ant-Man story, or what was the character who could be any, had the like each issue would be a different person, had this characters, the cosmic powers of this character.
Captain Ultra? No.
There was Captain something, I can't remember. But anyway, so Ditko was fun. So after Herb Trimpe was turned down by Stan, I think Tom, again, thinking of wanting to, get some work for this beloved artist, he suggested Steve Ditko. So I thought, oh my God, Stan's not gonna, he didn't like Herb Trimpe. Steve's work, as great as it is, was even more dated looking, than what Herb was doing. But I think I secretly knew I was going to be leaving. And I figured, how can I resist having a meeting with Stan Lee and Steve Ditko?
Yeah.
So I call up.
You were that guy, because Danny was telling me about the time Steve came in for a meeting with Stan.
Well, Stan was going to come into New York. And so we were setting up the meeting, and I got to call Steve. For people who knew Steve, he liked to chew gum a lot. Or he'd be like, sort of a laid back character. And usually when I would call him, it was always a good, cordial conversation. This time, I think I took him aback. He wasn't expecting it. I said, Steve, Stan's going to be coming into town, and he's working on a new character. And would you be interested, coming in for a meeting? Who knew what he would say? And there was a silence. And, you can sort of like write your own thought balloon, what Steve might be thinking. And Steve did not say this, and I have no knowledge of what he was thinking, but, I thought he was thinking in my imagination, so Stan's finally come crawling back, has he? But no, he just was completely professional and said, yeah, what time? I'll be there, et cetera, et cetera. So, you think you're in the business 20 years, you're going to be a little jaded, but I'm going to be in a meeting with Stanley and Steve Ditko. What better way to sort of end my time at Mighty Marvel?
Wow.
And they were great together. The only sort of regret I have now, years later, is because I was so aware that I was going to be leaving, that I just sort of focused on what Stan basically came in and was looking to find an artist for his Ravage thing. That was his goal. And he laid it out to Steve, and Steve was, listening politely and all that. And he explained that he didn't want to do an apocalyptic, negative future.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to do something, he gave an example, like Star Trek, where man has advanced and doing positive things. And there could still be conflicts and all sorts of superhero type stuff, but he didn't want to, a garbage man in the future wasn't what Steve wanted to do, but he was laying out what he was willing to do. He wasn't against the idea of working with Stan. And if I knew I was staying, I knew Stan well enough. I said, Stan, because Stan's default thing was to ask Steve, why don't we do another Spider-Man, a big reunion, you and me? Come on, Steve. And
that is an amazing impression of
Stan. I was around him long enough, and they were really, all the stuff you hear about the animosity and all that. There was no gun to his head. He wasn't, there wasn't any implied threat if you don't do this thing. No, it didn't affect it in anyone. Yeah, but Steve definitely didn't want to do that. And Stan asked him why not. And Steve answered that, and I understood it. He said he could never care about Spider-Man now as much as he did when he was working on it before. So he had done that. That exists. People want to see Spider-Man by Ditko. There it is. But, he had taken a different tact, in other words, the things he was doing at Marvel at that time were, tell me what you want. I'm a professional. I'll do it.
Yeah. And
the opportunity was there. Again, if I wasn't so obsessed with that I was leaving, so I figured, I was really being selfish and thinking, hey, I didn't think this, after he didn't like Shrimpy, he's not going to, go with Ditko anyway. I don't even know why he's asking him, it's all crazy. But how could I resist this opportunity to be in the same room with these two guys? But the reality, looking back on it, is like Ditko had held out that possibility that I think if I was staying, I could have said something like, I understand what you're saying, Steve. And Stan, maybe we could find someone else for this project. But I think it doesn't have to be Spider-Man. The idea of a brand new project with you and Steve, I think I could have sold it to both of them. And at that time, Ditko's art was still top notch. The stuff he did for me later on the Kirbyverse stuff was excellent work. So it would have been, fascinating to do. But, I blew it in that sense.
Ditko's stuff looked exactly the same from beginning to end. his quality
His
never went
very
down.
later stuff became a little bit cruder and not quite as, I mean, lots of artists have, highs and lows. I always liked Ditko's work no matter what,
Mhm.
but he was still very strong. And again, at Marvel, what they were doing was having other people ink them. The idea of, and like sometimes that worked out great. Sometimes didn't make much difference. But when he came to work for me at Topps, I was sort of obsessed. I said, Steve, I'd love for you to ink your own work again. And no other artist had said this to me. He said, I'll have to practice. I'll have to do my inking exercises. And I believe him. And, he's and he did beautiful, beautiful work. It's a very underrated, but he was a talented guy. It was such a thrill,
I like that you mentioned that he was was it smoking, but is very laid back. Oh no,
He
chewing
was
gum. He was
chewing
chewing
gum, yeah,
he's chewing gum
and walking at the same time. But
fans.
he was a very easygoing. I mean, he would, he has such a mysterious reputation.
Yeah.
He had his, there's a great book out now about Ditko, Ditko's philosophy and his comics, that a lot of people would just assume he was just a pure Ayn Rand, fanatic or something. But this book is very well written and really does an in-depth analysis of, Rand is a part of it, but he sort of really did develop his own, where he diverged and had his own views on things. And, and a lot of his work was very much misinterpreted. Whereas when he would be metaphorical, he would be taken as literal.
Yeah.
So when he would have characters standing by, like Mr. A, as someone dies, he wasn't advocating that. And I think this writer makes a good case.
It's interesting.
But even at Papercutz, there was a point where we were doing a kid's version of Tales from the Crypt.
Yeah.
And I thought, let me see, because, Steve had done wonderful horror stories, more fantasy, really, for Charlton, Marvel, all sorts of places. And I couldn't resist calling him again because he had done stuff for me at Topps and now at Papercutz. And he was very polite again. I could hear, he was considering it. But one of the most interesting things that stuck with me, the things he said was when he was asking about Papercutz, what's this company about? And I said, we're focused on doing all ages comics. We're really trying to do stuff for kids. And he said, he thought that was great. He said something I didn't agree with, but I welcomed it. He said, yeah, I think comics should be for kids.
Oh, okay. But so like for Papercutz, you are making comics for kids, but I know you don't believe comics should exclusively be for kids, but what?
Well, I think if I'm completely candid, there'll be titles that I think are probably best for the younger readers, the really youngest, just learned how to read. And then we're publishing stuff like Asterix, which is considered a classic.
Yeah.
That can be enjoyed by children and adults. And we managed to do that on certain titles, not with every title, but, I remember being a comics reader. Right. I don't think that's one of ours, but
no, it hasn't. Your versions haven't come to the Philippines yet, I don't think.
Well, we're mostly domestic, but I think it will get there in English. But it's such great material. But we when my partner, Terry Nantier, who was a brilliant graphic novel publisher, who started a company called NBM, who for years, he's a real pioneer in graphic novels in the United States, and that he was ahead of everyone else, focusing on trying to get graphic novels into bookstores and libraries, and a lot of what he did was, it was a mix. He did taking European comics, getting them translated into English to get an audience here. He was one of the first guys to really do complete hardcover collections of classic comic strips, like Terry and the Pirates and Buzz Sawyer. And he did original stuff as well. So at some point, when it seemed like almost the whole industry started doing comics and graphic novels for an older audience, he sort of wisely had noticed that, gee, not too many people are doing comics for kids anymore. It's almost as if a couple of generations were skipped, and there were a lot of reasons for that. Comics had become more expensive, difficult to find. They weren't at every newsstand anymore. You had to go to a comic specialty shop, and it was a lot of stuff that was going on. And he had noticed that manga at the time had exploded and was being sold in bookstores, and had, developed something that the mainstream comics at the time didn't have, was a large female audience. So he thought, here's an opportunity. Maybe we could do stuff that would be packaged, designed to be sold in bookstores, aiming at kids. And like our early efforts were even trying to do a manga style artwork in full color with very American properties like Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys. And if you want to know what the formula for failure in the direct comics market back then was, do kids comics in a manga style. They wanted nothing to do with it.
Because the manga people will know, because the manga fans will know it's not manga, and then
I don't think manga does well in the traditional comic book stores here. It does really well in regular bookstores.
Yeah.
And kids comics don't do well in the average comic book store. The wiser ones now have started, selling comics for kids, but it's mostly an older audience who is into superheroes. And so that was back when we started, and so we were this, Terry had this crazy idea of doing comics for kids again. And we had great success, and we're continuing to do well. But what happened was, because of our success, when we started, we were like, there was Archie Comics, there were, a few things here and there. Scholastic had a lot of success with Jeff Smith's Bone, etc. Now, every single publisher, comics publisher, book publisher, either they have their own kids graphic novel imprint, or they're publishing graphic novels for kids. And so we went from virtually no competition to unlimited competition. So it's been quite a ride, but it's great. It's great to see kids enjoying comics. It's one of those things where, if you believe conventional wisdom, like comics have been, according to some people, they've been dying for years. It's a dead medium. But I think it's just a matter of, particularly when I would hear some of my peers who their knowledge of the comics field is just seen through a Marvel or DC prism, where it's just comic book stores, period. They don't see that young kids today this was unthinkable in their childhood and my childhood. You can go to a library and get for free graphic novels. That to me is the greatest thing. I mean, one of the biggest things I hated was how expensive it was to be able to get comics. Now you could download them relatively inexpensively. You could go to the library, borrow them for free. The most expensive thing is still just buying them.
Have you heard of Webtoons?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's, it's your choice if you pay the artists and everything. The numbers there are insane, like millions upon millions of subscribers, sometimes like hundreds of thousands for like a middle grade comic.
Yeah, one of my friends who I worked with at Stanley Media is their top editor now.
Really? Okay, that's cool. I was
Yeah, no, there's
yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, I mean, there's one of the things that was surprising this past year with the pandemic. We figured, oh my God, this is going to be a nightmare. How can you sell books if bookstores are closed? And we were surprised that not only we do well, we did very well. As through the internet, people could buy our the physical copies, but our digital sales sort of quadrupled.
Yeah.
It was a big I think a lot of it was with kids having to stay home. Parents were looking for stuff that the kids could read as opposed to just playing video games all the time. And it wasn't just us. We didn't do anything particularly special, unfortunately, that I could say, oh, how brilliant we were. But the whole category of children's books did very well. And that was great for us. And, we're hopeful that, kids who had been exposed to our books, when things get better, will stick with us and keep trying our new titles, et cetera, et cetera.
Especially,
one book that Asterix did particularly well on the internet. I think adults who maybe don't want to go into a children's book section or whatever, like you could sort of like do it anonymously, and it's great. It's been great to see all this stuff happen.
Asterix is an interesting one because it's here in the Philippines, it's a staple in kids sections in bookstores. I'm not sure I've met big gigantic Asterix fans here. Obviously in Europe it's gigantic. It's a phenomenon.
Yes.
Why do you think it's had a difficult time in America?
Well, I could contrast it with another Belgian title, which is the Smurfs, which we publish. And the advantage there is back in the 80s, Hanna-Barbera did a Smurfs animated, Saturday morning TV show that was a huge hit. It was a hit throughout the entire 80s. It was like on for 10 years. And it was great. I mean, Marvel actually did some tie-in comics, but it was treated like it was a fad. They did 3 issues of a comic book, and they did a treasury, and they even did some mini comics, but they were in and out. We got the money, we're done. And they didn't really keep I think some of the graphic novels were published, and it was the same thing. They sold well, now we're out. And we were able to relaunch it here. And fortunately, new movies came out, which created awareness. And it's been doing very well for us. And there was, shockingly, it was one of our first series that did very well in comic book stores. I think because the people who were kids when the cartoons were on, and we're never really exposed to the original graphic novels.
Yeah.
And so as adults, they were buying the Smurfs. And
We didn't know. We didn't know it was based on
well,
anything.
so there, a lot of Americans just thought it was a cartoon show, and didn't realize that these comics existed. And we really had a lot of, we still are publishing a lot of the other characters that Peo created, Johann and Pee-wee, Benny Breakiron, et cetera, et cetera. And we've been very lucky with that. We knew going into it that Asterix was going to be a tougher sell, and trying to launch something during a pandemic isn't ideal. For example, we had an Asterix free comic book day comic that I myself wasn't able to get anywhere. Fortunately, I finally got some copies, but that's a great promotional tool. But if all the comic book stores are closed,
you can't get it anywhere.
Help. So one of the things we knew that, wasn't this great awareness, but these are good comics, and there's new graphic novels published all the time that aren't based on, cartoons or, TV or movies that are able to find an audience. And we thought the quality of material is really good. We could do it. One of the other things that I wanted to do is because I knew a lot of people, professionals in the comics field, when I would ask them about Asterix, they would acknowledge it. They knew it was successful. They knew it was well done. And I'd ask them and be surprised, and they'd say, I didn't really get it. And I think part of it was, and you have two schools on this, what Americans were seeing, up until a couple of years ago, was translations that were done mainly for a British audience in the 60s.
Interesting.
So there's a lot of things that are different, even though it's supposedly a common language. But there are things that are very much European that if you're doing it for a British audience, you don't need to explain. In Europe, it's still not uncommon for children in school to take a Latin class. That doesn't happen in the US. So there's lots of Latin phrases thrown in that in our version, we add little footnotes unobtrusively and at the bottom of the page, just to make it easier to understand. And there was a lot of controversy when we announced that we'd be retranslating the books, because we felt we wanted to Americanize it, but not to a silly extreme. In some ways, what we found is the people who hate this the most are the ones who grew up with the British adaptation. And it was a part of their childhood. They loved it. It was funny. They enjoyed it. They got it. They loved it.
That's fans for you.
So we're taking something they love and we're changing it.
But the version they love still exists.
Of course, and it will always exist in Britain. But what we're doing, surprisingly, is actually more faithful to the original French version. We're not adapting the English version. We're going back to the source material. And a lot of times, the translators were very good writers themselves. When they saw something that they were very aware that they were doing it for kids. And so they would add a lot of jokes that weren't in the originals. And we're forced to do that at times when there really isn't an equivalent, like if it's something that's based on the French language, it just won't translate. So we have to come up with stuff. So like there were people outraged. There's a druid character that in the original French, his name was Panoramix. in the British version,
Get a fix.
he was the one that supplies all the people in Asterix's village with the magic potion that gives them super strength.
Yeah.
So they cleverly named him Get a Fix, which I get it. I understand it. But in these more sensitive times in the US, something that's
Probably not
a
the best
drug-related
idea. Probably
joke.
not.
We went back to panoramics. I don't think anyone, except the people who love the British version, would be upset by that. So it's been, there are things that we're concerned about, and we're trying our best to, deal with it. One of the things we're going to be doing is having I wanted to do from the beginning, but I think it's going to be sort of retroactive. But fortunately, the books are selling well enough that when we go back to press, we can always make changes or alterations. And one of the things we're going to be doing is something I had done in some of the Smurfs books. We had like a series called Smurfs Anthology, which was more for older fans, where we had a lot of background material on the creator and putting the stories in context and, explaining what the references were, because, some of these stories are like 60 years old. So someone new, if they read, a Cleopatra story in Asterix, I mean, part of the context of that originally was the biggest movie at the time when that came out.
Yeah.
Was the Elizabeth Taylor Cleopatra film. And, so just providing a little background and explaining what's going on and who some of the people is, and also putting it into a cultural context. One of the things that the creators were trying to do is make fun of stereotypes.
Yeah.
And by, using satire. Humor has always been a very dangerous thing. And so that's a concern. So that's something we're trying to address as well. And I think the afterwards would try to explain it. And some of it was just how things were done at the time. And one of the things I really have to be super clear about, because it's absolute truth, is that the creators were in no way racist. It's sort of similar to Will Eisner. Yeah, I mean, like, it was a fully developed character. It just was unfortunate that particular, drawing of that character, falls into the stereotypical, approach at the time, which, even though it was in good intentions, when they've done recent revivals of the Spirit in comics, they've been very careful to alter that character.
Yeah, but the question would be, would a reprinting require a redrawing? And I think for the most part, whenever the Spirit has been reprinted, they've never redrawn Ebony.
Yeah, I mean, I think they have a disclaimer, and I think the audience for the Spirit as it is today is mostly adult.
Yeah.
So that kind of works. We're trying to make it, the Papercutz policy, all ages, where we could, have it be something that, going back to the Smurfs, for example, one of whenever we launch a new series, we never know if it's going to be a success or not.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's that opportunity, like, because we may not do one or two, we may only do one or two. So when we first started the Smurfs, I had to pick as the editor, which ones do we want to do first? And there was one that was never published in America, or I don't even know if it's ever been published in English. And it's a volume called the Black Smurfs, and or the Black Smurf. And what it was is again, it's the difference between Europe and America. In Europe, anyone going to school, they know about something called the Black Plague.
Yeah.
And that's what that was in reference to. It's very much like a zombie story where a normal Smurf gets bit by a fly, turns black, then sort of starts bouncing around, biting other Smurfs like a zombie. They turn black and keep doing it, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if a young African-American child sees a story called, oh, the Black Smurfs, they'd be totally justified in thinking, oh, this is exciting. I want to read this. And to see them sort of depicted as, hopping little cannibals could easily be misinterpreted as extremely racist. So what I did is when they were adapting the stories in the 80s for cartoons, they adapted that story and they just changed it to the Purple Smurfs. And I proposed that.
Seems like an easy fix.
Yeah, you'd think. And when I first proposed that, it was almost like sacrilege. The Smurfs are still pretty much owned by Peyo's family. His son and daughter, I think mostly his daughter now, run, the Smurfs enterprises. And to them, this is like sacred. This is their heritage. We don't want to tamper with it. But I could be persuasive at times, and I was lucky here in that I explained to them what the reasoning was, how it was done, and they were like a little hesitant. And I said, let me get you some samples of what we want to do. And it was ironic or coincidental, I don't know, that the artist we got was a Brazilian artist who remembered as a child his, being read that graphic novel when he was a kid on his mother's lap, his mother reading him the original version. And here I was asking him, go over all the Black Smurfs, outline them so we could color them purple. We weren't doing this, we weren't desecrating the original artwork. We're in the digital age now. So this is something that could be done. And we submitted it to them and they were like, fine, this is good. And that was our first Smurfs release, and it solved the problem. I think we kept the artwork very faithful. And it's something that if Peyo was still alive, he had already approved when he was alive the change for the cartoon show. So I think he would have understood. And so sure, let's do that. It was a great story. So it's tricky. It's trickier with Asterix because it's a big corporation that owns it, and the heirs of the original creators are still involved. So there's a whole bureaucracy that is concerned. And because it is so successful all over the world, they're not looking to tamper with success. When we first were expressing some of our concerns, I think first they're defensive, thinking that we're saying the creators were racist. We had, no, we know they weren't racist. And then it's been a process where we're trying to slowly move them along to get to the point where everything we're doing is we're trying to be as faithful to the original as possible, but tweaking it in a way that it'll work in right now.
Do you think it says something about your personality that given the wealth of Smurf stories you could have picked as your first one, you picked one where you had a problem to solve, a potentially contentious problem to solve?
No, you know what it really was? I don't speak French. And that was, I'm just a comics fan in the sense of when I'm told this is the one you can't read, it's not in English anywhere. Well, by golly, I want that one. I didn't realize what kind of trouble I was getting into. But it's just human nature. You want what you can't have. I want that. And the other one I published at the time, the first two, what wasn't really even a Smurf story. It was the first story they were introduced, Johann and Peewee's story, and it worked out okay.
I think it's refreshing to see somebody who's been in the business for so long, like just understand that the context changes, the culture changes, and that older stories may not have the same impact in a different place or a different time. I think that's refreshing to hear.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, like some things survive better than others. I mean, one of the good things about the Smurfs, by being set in this sort of imaginary time, pseudo medieval time, you don't have, they're, even though they've done stories that were topical in their own way. I mean, obviously, when they do the Astro Smurf, it was related to when man going into space was a big deal and what everyone was talking about. There's lots of stuff but generally it's sort of more timeless than other properties. So that one adapts very well. Something that's a little bit more sophisticated, like Asterix, with the more satirical content and what have you. It's interesting. I mean, the process we go through with Asterix is more detailed oriented than anything else we've ever published, and more so than anything else I've ever edited in my whole career, where we'll get the original French volume.
Yeah.
Our translator will translate it. My assistant and I will edit that. We submit it to the Asterix people in France. They have an auditor who, I guess it was probably some part of a deal early on when the creators wanted to make sure all the foreign versions would be okay, who reviews what we do. And we get back audits, which are like, virtually every page has like every line is questioned and why did you, and it's almost, then we send it back because the audit is in French and I still can't read French. And although my assistant's getting very good at it, our translator will respond to all the audit's things. Some of them, a lot of them, he'll agree with. He'll say, "Oh, okay, I didn't realize that. That works better." And some will say, "No, we want to do it this way." And it's almost like I have to write a legal brief, as if I'm defending my case against a comic book judge and who will decide. And like every single thing will be like, well, yes, this, we did this for this reason, we did this for that reason. And, they really do, they're very protective and caring about the property. In some ways, they've been more protective of the artwork, whereas they're less, and I think it could be, I'm just speculating that, the original writer has been gone, a lot longer than the original artist, who only passed away last year.
Yeah.
So, and it's easier to make changes with text. It just, you just got to make sure you can fit it into the original word balloons. So they're they don't mind, obviously, with the British adaptations where characters' names were changed, jokes were changed, et cetera, et cetera. We're sort of going backwards to the original and at the same time trying to Americanize it, which is why there's all these little debates that pop up, and trying to, but it's good. I think it's good for us to question what we're doing, and if we don't have a good reason, then why did we do it? So it keeps us on our toes, and they're very good. They're very smart, but it is a difficulty at times, because when you have this property that's so successful all over the world, it's hard for them to really imagine how it's not that here, and that we have. So whatever they're doing, as you know, like say whenever a new Asterix graphic novel comes out in Europe, it's a big deal.
Yeah.
You know, it's like this is something, you know, generations have grown up with. And unlike American comics, when a character like Spider-Man is successful, you know, there's like virtually 10 Spider-Man comics a month or more, or a week even. And whereas Asterix, it's an event. It's only really one every 2 years at most. So it is a big deal. And in Europe, it could be played that way, where we would be laughed at here in the US if we tried the same approach. Like, attention media, the new Asterix book will be coming out. You know, what? Who cares? You know. So it is a challenge, but the material is so good that I think, you know, I mean, as I said, we've already gone back to press a few times on what we've already released. And one of the advantages for a small publisher like us to use existing material is we don't have the expense of hiring artists, writers, letterers. I mean, we're basically editorially involved with just creating the translation and getting new lettering and designing the
repackaging and the marketing. So with Asterix, of course, it is about a Gaul named Asterix. I think it ages very well specifically because it doesn't take place in the present day. I think things that take place in the present
50
day,
BC, I believe.
yeah, I think things that take place in the present day just don't age very well. Like, but things that take place in the future, those really don't age very well.
Yes, it's totally true. But you know, like the you know, again, like I feel sometimes so like how I mean, it's almost like, you know, I have a whole company that's selfishly designed so I could read all the comics. You know, so I'm reading them a lot of times for the first time, even though there were these British editions all these years. Yeah. I feel the version I'm getting now is closer to the you know, the scripts by Goscinny, and who had worked. He had spent some time in America and had even done a children's book with Harvey Kurtzman. So I see some of that. You know, he definitely has his own style, but there's also I think a little bit of that Kurtzman type of humor in the stories, and just overall the stories are very funny, well done. You know, works on almost every level. Great art, great stories. It's I think once someone gets into it, you know, it's like I mean, I think the 39th graphic novel will be coming out this year. So, you know, try to read every Spider-Man comic ever published. You can't do it, but we're doing like 3 Asterix albums in 1 volume. So in a few years, we'll have all of them in print, and it'll be possible if someone wants to, they could just, I love Asterix, so they could have like, you know, 15 volumes or less, and be able to get the whole experience.
Yeah, I gave up after 200 issues of Amazing Spider-Man. I'm like, that's it. This is impossible. I can't possibly read everything. But with Asterix, I think the thing that I am curious about the translations because, reading the British edition, I can see that there's a lot of puns, and I'm bilingual. Translation is hard. It's not an easy thing to do. Uh, does your translator express any explicit challenges, or that they have?
This has been a tougher one for him than anything else, but I think we're very fortunate. He's Joe Johnson. He's a college professor in Georgia, and sometimes he may, because even in America, there's Southern
Yeah.
American English, there's Northern. So we try to keep it somewhere. I try not to be a Northern snob. So sometimes I keep, it's like the amount of decisions there are. So, I mean, it's on such a minute scale. I mean, there was something I was convinced was just a coloring mistake in the original. And figured, oh, well, we could fix this very easily. I mean, that's happened a lot in this, not a lot, but it happens in the Smurfs or other books that are been around a long time. Oh, look at that. Here's some little minor thing that we could easily fix, with digital technology. It's not a big deal. But they look at it so closely, like it was something that I thought wasn't originally colored. So we colored it. And they came back to us and they said, no, that has to be white. But it doesn't make any sense that way. And they said, no. Like years ago, I think they updated the color on all the Asterix books and they preserved it exactly the way, even though, it was now more airbrushy and there were more blends and, the more stuff you could do with digital color that you couldn't do with flat color. They were determined, no. Like this is sacred. Like, and in the scheme of things, when you got to choose your battles, I figured, in one little panel, one little thing that it's not colored, it's been in print for 60 years that way. Okay. I'm not going to go to war over that.
Do you have a favorite character in Asterix?
That's a hard one. He's obviously, he's a lot of fun. He's this sort of the kid in all of us. He's just irresistible. So, I mean, the two of them together are, it's like, who do you like more, Laurel or Hardy? It's the whole thing is well done, and I don't know if I have a favorite yet. I think one of the things that really works well for us is I think what may have put off readers before in America when they were reading the British versions, I really do think what we've done is made it a little bit easier because they are, it's nothing complicated about it. One of the things I was, it's always this battle for control. And I wanted to, one of the things we're doing that we don't do in any of our other books, and I wanted to do it, and I don't think it wound up coming out the way I wanted, is I wanted to have one cover for the hardcovers and a completely different cover for the paperbacks. But there were so many rules on what I can and can't do that even when I argued, and I think they may have been somewhat sympathetic, like I took the previous omnibus editions, and if you just look at this cover and you're an American kid, say you're 11 years old, I argued to them that the only words they understand on this cover are and the. They don't know what Gaul is. They don't know what Asterix is. They don't know what omnibus is. It's like and you're not letting me put anything else there. It's
That's
very tricky.
true.
So they give me more freedom on the back covers, but and they let me do a bunch of things. I mean, on the previous omnibuses by the other publisher, it would say Asterix like several times, it would say like at the very top, an Asterix, and then the title of the story would always be Asterix in Philadelphia, wherever you went, that that book, Asterix in Spain. Okay, you got Asterix twice now.
Yeah,
Then
the
at
one
the
I have
bottom,
right now
because it's an
says
omnibus.
Belgium. Yeah.
Yeah, they would list all three stories. Asterix here, Asterix there. I was like, whereas I felt, I mean, you have this such a easy. I mean, it's almost like another version of Popeye in a way, in that it's this character who has a potion and gets really strong and can take on the bad guys. So it's very easy to understand. It's nothing intellectual about it on that very basic level. It's the underdog against, you don't have to be a history major,
But it'll
it
help.
helps. Yeah, and you can enjoy it on that level. But just if you're a kid, if you're just looking for a fun story, as with Obelix, I mean, they're just funny characters, So I enjoy working on it a lot. And one of the things that it's a little off in the future still, but just as this year, there's going to be a new Smurfs animated series on Nickelodeon. It was just announced, so I could finally talk about it. Netflix is going to be doing
Asterix.
An Asterix animated, series, a limited series. And what I found funny about that was, for some minor character in some of the early volumes, where we would make up sometimes new names, and a lot of them, for the Gaulish characters, a lot of the names would end with IX. So it was this character who I think was only in 4 panels. I decided to name Netflix.
Yeah.
And they said, no, you can't call him that. Okay. Call him something else.
The estate said you can't call him that, or Netflix said you can't call him that?
They did that. I don't think they were even aware that this was going to happen, but maybe they were. Maybe that was their reason. But I just thought it was like another example is there was an issue where there were some great actors, and they were sort of parodies. It didn't look like them, but it was just the actors' names were, pun versions of Alec Guinness and Laurence Olivier.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember. So I didn't have a problem with that, actually, but some of the people, I think they were saying, well, maybe you can make it something that younger. So, and then okay. So we changed this into something like Matt Damius and Ben Affleck's with the X,
Ben
the
Affleck.
IX at the end. And, which I think works in the context of the story. It didn't have to be these, for a kid, it's like, well, I know who they're making fun of, as opposed to maybe they knew Alec Guinness was Obi-Wan Kenobi, but
But they're not getting it, Laurence Olivier.
Unfortunately, no.
Yeah.
The older audience might get that, but we're I hope Matt Damon and Ben Affleck appreciate it.
How involved are you guys in the Netflix series?
Not at all.
Not at all.
No, but what's good about it is when it creates more awareness. I mean, there's been a lot of properties we've done, and it's a tricky thing. It's more tricky with movies, in that even if the animation, the TV show, or the movie isn't great, the fact that, particularly if it's a movie, they'll spend millions of dollars to promote it. That creates awareness of that property. So when the kid is in the store and he sees it, oh, I know what that is. It's not, and that usually works out well. Where it sometimes backfires is if we do a property and there's a movie or especially a movie, and the movie comes out, and in this day and age, everything is quick. Like if in the first week it's not a hit, they're calling it a bomb, a flop. And retailers, booksellers, what have you, they only have so much shelf space. So if they think something's a flop, they're going to quickly pull it off the shelves. So no matter how great our comics are, that's it. It's all over. So it's a very risky proposition. Not so, it's better if whatever we're doing is already ongoing. So, with Asterix, the booksellers, retailers will have a history of having success with it. So when something else comes out, if all goes well, it'll just expand the audience some more. Worst case, if it doesn't help at all, on something like that, we hope to still maintain whatever level we were doing before it came out. But I'm optimistic. I think it'll do well. And I don't think it'll be the biggest thing in the world, but it helps and it builds. It's like everything I was saying before. It applies to Asterix. You had the same creative team for as long as Goscinny was alive. And and it's been carefully maintained ever since. You don't look at the new graphic novels and go, oh my God, who's drawing that? They're still trying to preserve the original style and feel of the original creators.
You've blown my mind today on two things. The first one is I was wondering why Asterix struggled in America. And I realized it's because it was translated specifically for everywhere else except America now, because not all English is the same.
Right.
And I think we take that for granted. So like people think like it only needs one English translation. That's not true.
There were a lot of people who enjoyed that here. And, just as there are lots of people, myself included, who love British movies, comedies, etc. But it's not really a mainstream thing. And there was a lot of stuff that was, in a way, it sort of intimidated. It just seemed more, out of reach, and there was an intellectual side of it, but it was the translation that was making it seem inaccessible. Whereas once, once I don't have any problems explaining it to kids. They don't need to know history.
Yeah.
Here's a village. All these guys are called the Gauls. The everyone else is the Roman soldiers, and they're the ones that got them, trapped here. But they're able, with this magic potion, to fend them off and and survive, and everything goes from there. And the characters are incredibly likable. It works out really well.
You don't need to know history to like it, but I got into Asterix really late. I only started reading it when I was in my mid-20s. But I imagine that it's the kind of thing where if a kid reads it, then they get interested in history. It's highly possible.
Yeah, it's always fun. You learn a lot more when you're not aware that someone's trying to teach you something. And there's a lot in there, and it's and it's enjoyable. I mean, if like so many kids who grew up with Marvel Comics, they would be surprised that just through, they weren't picking it up Marvel books to increase their vocabulary, but Stan
But it did.
didn't write down. And so when they were in school, they would be surprised, like if they were in the 5th or 6th grade. Well, I know what cataclysmic means. Why don't these other kids know what that is? And it was just, by the sheer storytelling, which is one of the reasons, even back when I was doing Spidey Super Stories, I was happy to work on it. I enjoyed it in many ways, particularly working with John Romita Sr. But in many ways, I thought, this is the silliest thing in the world. I learned to read by reading Spider-Man comics. The concept of there has to be a Spider-Man comic for kids
is ridiculous.
That's what it was.
Yeah.
And because it wasn't written down, but I think both worked.
Yeah.
I was, I've met so many people who enjoyed it that I can't argue with that. So there was I think what that did more than anything else is with all the seals of approval that this is a good comic book and it's pro-educational and kids will learn how to read. So kids who probably may not have been allowed to get comics on their own because people thought, that's junk, bad for kids. And this thing had that sort of seal of approval. It was sort of like, a gateway drug for a generation to get into Marvel Comics.
The other thing you blew my mind on was for years I've had this thought experiment and where I kind of just toss it to other comics fans, comics historians, and I'm like, can you name anything that's even remotely like Popeye? and their answer is always like, you're right, there is nothing remotely like Popeye. But you just blew my mind. I'm like, oh yeah, the thing that is remotely closest to Popeye is Asterix.
He's this little guy who takes something and becomes, super strong, and they're all great stuff. I mean, and he's, I think it's a similar appeal. That whole village, like the Popeye clan, are very down to earth characters, going up against usually, more pompous characters like Julius Caesar. It's sort of the Columbo formula, where the TV show with Peter Falk as this detective who plays dumb. He's like the common. He's sloppy and hey, who are you? And the villains are always these very aristocratic, sophisticated snobs who think they've outsmarted him, and they always underestimate him. And so, both of these are Popeye, Asterix. They have that very simple core human characters of like they're just common people. They like to eat boar. They like to party and not have people conquer them.
I think another similarity between the two is that they're just living life. They don't go around like looking to right or wrong or anything. It's just trouble ends up finding them, and they just want to be left alone in their little village. And I think that's you blew my mind today, sir. So
well, it's just a lot of fun. I mean, it's like it occurred to me. I didn't think it originally, but the more I got into it, then I began to see, similarities. But there's so many, comics that I've been so lucky to be involved with, and we've only, believe it or not, it's just the tip of the iceberg that we were able to talk about. But And that's what makes it exciting for me.
Danny's been on the show like 3 times. If you want to
Oh,
follow.
okay. I think maybe with just this one episode, I probably lasted longer than all his appearances, but who knows?
And
No.
no.
Good.
No, Danny, his first one I had to split into 2. So he's actually been on the show 4 times.
Right. No,
But-
he's Danny and I have a great time. We haven't been able to do it this past year. Is a lot of times we'll appear at conventions together at the same table, and it's just a lot of fun. He's great, and he has all his books to sell. And one of the things I started doing years ago, I went to a New York local convention, the Big Apple convention, and I was sitting next to this really incredible artist, Russ Heath.
Oh, wow.
And, he would be able to, he would have on the table, his price list for, if you did a head sketch, it was this much money, a figure, it was that much money. And, and it was all beautiful artwork. And since I was next to him, I'm sort of like a lot of people in comics, a frustrated cartoonist myself. I made a sign that said, "Lousy sketches, $5." And then people started asking for it, and I started doing it. And I think I've really enjoyed it. I did go to, the High School of Art and Design in New York. I think originally maybe I wanted to be a comic book artist, but I think my stuff is far more cartoony. And when I got to Marvel, I was thinking, oh, I can't do this Neil Adams, John Buscema, more realistic type of stuff. So if I want to be in comics, I better find something else I could really do. And so I did almost everything there was at one point or another, and did a lot of writing. But mostly, I think I like editing because it's almost where you get to be the ultimate comics fan, and
just got to put it together.
Yeah, you get to work with. If they're available, over the years, I've worked with so many people and continue to do so, and it's never ending. It's like there's a new. I don't think I'm even exaggerating that what's happened in recent years is that we have so much more knowledge of comics from around the world that, I don't think a week goes by where I'm not, exposed to some artist who maybe was famous in Japan for forever, but I was unaware of, and I get to see all this great material being translated into English.
It's crazy,
and,
isn't it? Yeah.
It's wonderful. I think, one of the odd things, I understand it. I think it's also a practical matter, like these, just to be able to buy all this stuff can be very expensive. But so it makes sense to sort of specialize. So a lot of people, it used to be, I had the advantage again as a kid. Marvel, during the 60s was maybe a dozen titles a month, which maybe came down to 4 or 5 comics at most a week.
Yeah.
When they were priced at 12 cents, 15 cents, whatever, quarter. It was always very affordable. And it was always felt like the biggest bargain ever. Now, I still buy a lot. I think I buy more graphic novels than I do comics, floppies, but
me too. Yeah.
The comics, that equation hasn't, to pay $5 for a comic book that you might read in, 15 minutes when there's all these streaming services now where you can get infinite amount of movies for
Yeah.
$10, or you could get 2 comic books that'll only take you, an hour to read at most. I think that's probably the biggest source of trouble for the comic book industry these days.
Tough
So
problem to solve.
webtoons, other things like that. Even Marvel.com has their own
Yeah, unlimited.
subscription service where you could. So I think those are those are pointing the way to comic book survival.
It's nearing midnight your time, so I only have 2 questions left. I just want to give you the time to kind of plug the other paper cut stuff. What do you other stuff that you think needs a boost or could use a boost, or you'd like to recommend to anybody who might be watching this?
Well, I love it all, and it's always exciting. Whatever the next project is you're working on. So I could probably mention a few. I mean, again, we do a lot of things that have been published in Europe. We do original stuff. One of the new titles we do, it's called School for Extraterrestrial Girls.
Yeah.
That's doing very well for us right now. There's a lot of cartoonists whose work I love. So whenever I get to work with them, Art Baltazar, who's known for the Tiny Titans and a million other things, very productive guy. He's doing a series for us called Gilbert, about a little, undersea type character, a little merman type of character. He's green. One of my favorite writers, cartoonists of all time in European comics is Louis Trondheim. And we've done some stuff before. We did Monster before with him. There was a book which Fantagraphics had come out with, which I think I have under my computer, which I can't find right now. Ah, I found it. With this title I could barely pronounce. And
Approximate Continuum Comics. Okay.
yeah, and it was sort of an autobiographical thing he did, very cartoony. He portrays himself as this sort of bird-like humanoid creature, but it was like him when he was young and going to make the transition from a single guy to living and working in a comic art studio in town versus getting married, starting a family, having a home in the suburbs. And one of the things he was working on when this was that he writes and draws about was a series called The Fly, which was I admire his cleverness so much. I mean, here he was, he's a French cartoonist. He had an agent who was able to get him work, and he got him a gig doing something for a Japanese publisher.
Okay.
And his solution was no dialogue. You just do it.
Smart.
Yeah, I would have. It seems so obvious once you think about it. And the character he came up with was, a little fly that you get his whole life story, and he's just very funny. He's very, and this book had promised. Well, the next one will be The Fly, and this came out years ago. And the editor, of course, was the brilliant Kim Thompson, who was responsible for a lot of the French material that Fantagraphics published. But I think, maybe it was hard tracking down the rights or something. So this became like a little personal dream project. And my assistant did above, his name's Jeff Whitman, who also edits for Papercutz, a great job tracking down the rights to this. And so we're finally going to be able to bring it out. This sort of Louis Trondheim classic, where it's in
Awesome.
black and white, Story of the Fly, and again, you can see I'm just really just selfish comic book fan. I read about it here.
And you
It
want
didn't
it.
come out. I want it, and they're indulging me in that, since I'm the only one here who can't speak French, because this was a completely silent comic. I'm listed as translator for this one.
And my last question, speaking of being a fan and wanting to see something come out, how did you feel watching the Marvel Cinematic Universe unfold, seeing two big movies headlined by Thanos of Titan, and never seeing a helicopter?
You haven't seen it yet. Did you see WandaVision?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There was a
Had
helicopter.
a helicopter in it. That little thing that came in and was one of the first things in color, and who knows? But there's
It's a legendary Thanos moment. You created a legendary Thanos moment. My last name is Tano, so I was in the second grade in when the Infinity Gauntlet was coming out, and I went to an all boys school, so the insults were very obvious and nonstop. It was always calling me Thanos, but when that issue of Spidey Super Stories, which for some reason was abundant in the Philippines, and a lot of people had it and had it passed around.
collector's item now.
It's the helicopter.
It was just a lot of fun. I did all sorts of silly things, because I just wanted it to be fun. I remember this was way back. There was a period where New York City, just like now, was facing various fiscal crises, and I did some sort of very mild parody, with a story with the kingpin and all that kind of stuff. And sometimes, as much as I love working in comics, there are times when you're working away and you're thinking, no one's paying attention to what we're doing. The focus is on all this other stuff. And like at the time, like I did that silly story, and then the next thing I knew, it was in the front pages of the Daily News. It was like, and it sort of
Really?
re-inspires you. But one of the things that so exciting to be able to watch the Marvel Cinematic Universe is it's almost the unreality of remembering being there. I remember when Jim Starlin was in the office when he did his first issue of Iron Man, and I remember Thanos being introduced, et cetera, and there were so many elements that have been picked up in the movies and now the TV shows. I edited the second Vision Scarlet Witch limited series where she gave birth to the twins, and it had Agatha Harkness, et cetera, et cetera. To now see these things come to life, on TV or in movies, it's just so exciting, so much fun. I think Kevin Smith, of all people, sort of commented that, particularly with WandaVision, that it's come the closest to recreating his childhood experience of being excited about the comics every week. By this show, when it was coming out every Friday night, you couldn't wait for it. That like they managed to replicate, so many of the soap opera aspects of comics. And I mean, this is so unthinkable to me that if ever there was a series that you could argue had such a convoluted, so much history, those characters, the Vision
The
and
Scarlet
the
Witch.
Scarlet Witch, to see that become a mass, popular success, it's just incredible. I mean, even when, Stan Lee was doing his cameos, and he, in a sense, became a certifiable celebrity himself, where everyone knew who he was, and he'd be popping up on TV all the time and everywhere. It's hard to explain what it's like to, someone who, even though I idolized him back then, it's the feeling of, hey, remember your boss when you were 15 years old? He's world famous now. And every aspect of, it's as if the Marvel Cinematic Universe, especially now with the TV series, they have all 80 years of Marvel history where they could just, pick out all the good little bits and mix it up all together and create something that's new and exciting. So it's just wonderful to have been a part of that and to witness what it is now. And fortunately, Marvel's, treating us old guys better than ever, and inviting us to the screenings, having us write introductions, et cetera, et cetera. I think you mentioned Danny is even doing a new Darkhawk story.
Yeah, he is. That's one of
So
the episodes he was on for. Was talking about Darkhawk.
So I don't think they're bringing Spidey Superstars back soon, but when they do, I'm ready.
The Thanos copter.
Exactly. They actually made some toys
yes,
of the Thanos copter.
I
don't have one, but
I
yeah.
think I think I speak for all fans when I say thank you for your part in bringing all that to life, all that stuff that you're doing now. It's always great. It's always great.
Thank you so much.
Comics
It's
are
as
awesome.
the whole thing is to make it as much fun for me as I hope it is for others. Thank you.
You're the only audience that you're going to definitely please, so you may as well, right?
Yeah. I mean, life is precious. Like you have to do whatever you can to enjoy every day, and going through this pandemic is like so many people were struggling in so many different ways. And if, not just what we do, but comics in general is something that people, despite everything else going on in the world, I hope they can enjoy and have fun and bring some meaning and joy to them. So it's a fun thing. I mean, sometimes the more serious critics would dismiss escapism as being, worthless. There are times people really do need to escape, and it helps.
I think the past
helps
year
us
is a
get
good
through.
indication of that. Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.